This is a very difficult talk for me to give, and I've got more butterflies in my stomach than usual for a variety of reasons. One thing is that actually my mum is in the audience. I've got one of my oldest friends in the audience who's a kind of political kindred spirit. I've got some of the people that influenced my work in the audience, and I've been watching the talks through Twitter and looking at some of the papers. I haven't actually been here for the rest of the event, but the level of discourse here has just been phenomenal. And so there's a certain kind of feeling of being stripped bare here, because I mean, you're all in the same kind of boat that I am, and so that makes it quite difficult. It's also difficult because of the state of the world right now. And, normally this kind of ending talk, kind of a keynote at the end of an event, is supposed to be really upbeat and, we're going to do this and it's going to be fabulous and everything's wonderful and, all the stuff we've talked about, let's go out and do it. And it's really difficult to do that right now because things are actually kind of bleak. And to a certain extent, I was thinking about this talk and it was becoming more and more bleak. It was becoming more and more kind of depressing. And I've been trying to push through this. And one of the ways I've decided to push through this is to just state very clearly some of the things that I see, some of the crises that we're facing, some of the logical contradictions in the way that we're working, to talk about some of the things that I see that are actually giving me some kind of positive feeling about what's going on there, and then to talk about some of my projects that I've done over the last few years. But the thing I want to do is I want to talk about their failures and the things that have gone wrong, or the limitations of them, rather than just saying, oh, this is wonderful and loads of people loved it. I want to talk about the limitations of this stuff, because I think one of the fundamental things about participatory work, about any kind of structuring participation, is that actually the extent to which you will have something that succeeds is the extent to which something also fails, if you see what I mean. That kind of embracing of failure is absolutely essential to it. And I mean that at the level of a kind of the practitioner, but also just, even at the level of thinking about the way one might bring any of these kinds of processes into the daily creation of cities. One of the problems that city systems, that urban systems, that city councils have is that they cannot do participatory stuff because it's very difficult to say what success metrics are, and the chances of failure are very high. And of course, citizens hold their councils accountable for money misspent, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's this kind of dynamic which precludes the capacity for truly innovative participatory work to infiltrate itself into the way that we actually build and kind of design our cities. And so I really do want to talk about failure a bit, and it's not to sort of like beat down the work, but rather to say, what, the one takeaway from all of this is that in participatory projects, we have no idea what the end product is, and we are all going to have to figure this out together. We're all going to have stuff that doesn't work. We're all going to have stuff that does work, and really the task is to embrace that capacity to do stuff that really might not even fit together very well, but to make it just happen nonetheless. What that means essentially is, structuring participation around collaborating even though we might not have consensus, and that's a bit of a contentious thing, but I hope to kind of tease some of this stuff out. So by background, I'm actually an architect, and I've always been interested in the relationship of people to their spaces, to other people, and I've ended up really being interested not in structure as an architect, but infrastructure, which is the stuff upon which other people can build stuff. That's kind of the way I see it. And as I've got more and more interested in participatory systems, the two tasks that I've sort of taken away that need to be achieved is, one is designing something so as to increase the number of possible outcomes. Now, I say that because often designers are kind of encouraged to simplify stuff right? And there's this whole kind of discourse, especially coming out of MIT Media Lab, about simplifying interfaces and things like that. And I think that's a fundamental problem to sort of apply simplistic, linear, static models to the way we interact with the world. So actually, yes, participatory design is about increasing the number of possible outcomes. The second task, I think, is not to achieve something very specific as an output, but to build this shared memory of a possible future, a shared memory of what we can do next, if you see what I mean. And that means essentially answering the question, not what will we do, but how do we do it? How do we actually do this stuff together? And the reason that this is so kind of important right now is that I see this kind of collision of three infrastructures in our daily lives today. And there are fundamental incompatibilities in our democratic infrastructures and democracy. Democracy is supposed to be the thing upon which we can all sort of be very proud and pat ourselves on the back. In our urban infrastructures and the kind of relationship of citizens to their cities, and thirdly, our kind of technological infrastructures. So, to talk I mean, this is a truism now, but the fact is that our democratic processes now are decided mostly by untruths and those who do not participate. And this is a fundamental incompatibility with the definition of democracy. So this is the first thing, that we just, we either throw it out or we build something new, or it absolutely has to be challenged immediately. The second is this kind of triangle of inequality, geography, and climate change. In the bottom right-hand corner is Miami, where, of course, the threat of flooding is getting worse and worse and worse. This was a photograph recently of an octopus in a parking garage. I mean, this is actually affecting Miami right now. I had other photos that I didn't put in here of sort of sports cars that were getting flooded in these garages. The fabric, the shape of our cities is changing. And so what I've done is I've just put a map up there of London. Now, Hanson's last paper, I believe, talked about a potential 5-meter rise in sea level over the next 70 to 80 years. Possible, I mean, there's people who go higher and people who go lower. But if it does, I mean, the very shape of London, which, by the way, if you look in the bottom right-hand corner, the red is, of course, the sort of predominantly Labour councils, correlates almost directly to where the effects of the sea level rise are going to take place. Now, in terms of climate change, I think different parts of the world are, of course, going to be affected in different ways. But sea level rise is coming, and there's no getting away from it. And in Western cities especially, and particularly in London, it's sea level rise rather than anything else that I think is really going to impact us. So again, there's this kind of, we've got COP21, which we've signed up to, and where we're going to be changing the way we live our lives somehow in the next 30 years. So again, it's the way we live our lives is radically going to change. And then thirdly, our technological infrastructures. So there's so much investment and so much talk and so much kind of enthusiasm for this idea of these smart cities and these sort of cities where technology is the answer, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what's actually happening is that through these kind of technological processes, through these algorithms, through these sorts of security infrastructures that are basically making decisions on our behalf, the result is this kind of abdication of responsibility. The technology is there so that we don't have to be responsible for what is decided. And as designers, that becomes very problematic because, designers are supposed to decide in a sense, right? You decide what to design, when to design, where to design, how to design, et cetera, et cetera. And this, this kind of trajectory of effectively kind of turning stuff over to smart city infrastructures, which are based on parameters of efficiency, of optimization, of security, of convenience. These are not the definitions of a valuable, sustainable city. These are definitions of a very small software product delivered by IBM. But this is the way that cities are being planned and deployed right now. These are the decisions that are being made in councils right now about this kind of infrastructure that is basically supposed to take decisions on our behalf. Now, if you layer onto that, this is, by the way, the Smart City Operations Center in Rio de Janeiro. If you layer onto that The fact that the NSA is accessing your personal data. The fact that there are massive data breaches just because of misplaced password. The fact that Volkswagen fakes their emissions data. This is the smart city, right? As much as the operations center, Volkswagen faking their data is the smart city. Tesla beta testing features on the road and basically putting people in danger. That is the smart city, as much as any other kind of technological infrastructure. The fact that a 15-year-old boy can hack into a comms company, a telco, that is the smart city. And Mark Zuckerberg basically saying, oh, it's totally crazy to think that Facebook would fake news would influence the voting. I mean, he seems to have backtracked on that in the last few days. But, you know, all of this, fake news, fake data, breach data, this is the smart city, right? There is no kind of perfect smart city in that operations center that Brazil thinks it's going to deploy. So we have very dumb smart cities coming very soon. So the question is, when we are designing for this kind of collision of these three different crumbling infrastructure types, who is it that designs? Who makes the fundamental decisions, right? Who decides when, not, you know, where and when and how and who and why? I would put it to you that basically we need to be making these decisions together. And so the fundamental participatory process is to structure so that we can make decisions together, because nobody has kind of, what do you call it, ownership over a solution that's actually going to be sustainable. There are clues, I think, to the way a smart city, I hate the phrase smart city, but it is a catchphrase for something. There are clues for the way that the smart city might actually emerge. And I think it's in things like the Madrid 15M movement, where these kind of structures of collaboration around a palette structure emerged, where people could communicate and have this kind of center of control and communication and swapping of information and collaboration. There were clues in Occupy Sandy, where the whole decision-making to respond to a crisis was decentralized, and it wasn't some kind of hierarchy of a government hierarchy that responded to the needs. So this kind of structure of decision-making emerged. In the Umbrella Revolution, in Hong Kong, what I saw there was this amazing kind of sense of empathy, this sort of way of people to just share stories, to come out, because there'd never been a big tradition of protest in the way that it manifested itself in Hong Kong. And suddenly people could see each other in the streets and say, oh my God, we are sharing some similar experience. And then finally, these kinds of structures of communication that I take optimism away from are, for example, actually I don't have a link here to this, but if you're familiar with the human microphone, which emerged in the Occupy Wall Street movement, which was basically a way where the idea of public broadcast, of amplifying voices was prohibited in public space in New York. And so you weren't allowed to have a speaker and a microphone. And what emerged was this process whereby the person speaking would say a few words, then the first kind of few rows of people next to them would repeat that out loud, and then the next row and the next row. And they're basically sorts of wonderful roles of communication, in which everyone was involved in broadcasting the message. And secondly, in Nathan Phillips Square, where I don't know whether you've seen this, but every now and then at some kind of politically or socially important moment, the very fabric of the city becomes a blackboard on which people just inscribe all sorts of things in chalk, messages, drawings, sketches, jokes, whatever, ways to kind of reach out and connect to people. All of that, I think, is the feature of the authentically smart city that I kind of want to see. Now, when I'm talking about all of this, I'm not talking about wisdom of the crowd. Very often, and you know, as participatory designers, you've probably experienced this as well. People think, oh, you know, this is just about wisdom of the crowd, and you know, that's okay for certain situations, but it doesn't really deal with anything important. I'm not talking about wisdom of the crowd here. I'm not just saying, you know, for the sake of involving more people and making ourselves feel better because we've got everyone involved here. I'm talking about this for very practical reasons, which is that when you get people working together and kind of developing this kind of sense of agency, when you're kind of deciding together and you actually are effectively involving people in being more responsible for outcomes, and when you kind of like act together and people have this kind of sense of accomplishment, then actually the capacity for something to persist in the world, and if you want to use really sort of council-centric language, the return on investment is massive, right? When you don't involve people, and again, I'm just going to use this sort of blatant financial language, the externalities, the cost of externalities is just ridiculous. You put all this money into something and it doesn't really persist. That happens again and again and again. So when I talk about involving people in decision-making and deployment and in kind of taking ownership of something, it's actually for very practical reasons, which is that if we want to fucking do something about this world, we have to do it together. And we have to be able to take responsibility for it, and we have to be able to take ownership of it all together. Excuse my language, sorry, Mum. So, on that note, I'm going to talk about a few projects, about 8 projects, quite briefly, because I kind of want to get to the bit where I sort of discuss a little bit about the limitations. I've decided to call it not failures, because then I could have perhaps titled this lecture "A Chronicle of My Failures." No, it's going to be the limitations of each of the projects. Because I think I want to kind of paint this picture that when you are working in the kind of discipline as I have been, no single project ever kind of answers everything, and ideally every project is somehow building on or exploring some kind of new aspect of the area. So Open Burble was a project from now 11 years ago, and it was in Singapore. It was the first project that I did on a kind of large scale, and it was the first project where I wasn't really necessarily thinking a huge amount about citizen engagement or participation or anything like that. Partly I was involving members of the public because the budget was so tight and we needed lots of people to be part of this thing. But partly because at the time I was very interested in Jack and the Beanstalk and this idea of kind of growing something in your backyard. And basically after a series of many, many iterations of this project, it kind of turned into this thing where there was a modular system where members of the public could come and erect a structure basically 18 stories tall. And so actually alter their skyline, even if only for a short time. Here we see the slides, the modules of these sorts of carbon fiber structure with balloons, and inside of these are LEDs. People are coming along and they're basically assembling molecules of this thing in the public space there, and then they're inflating it. So again, this is about them first designing part of the structure, then actually erecting it. And here we have a little bit of video as it kind of goes up. Now, once it's up, the way it lights up and the patterns of light that flow through this thing are explicitly determined by how it was configured in the first place, because along the bottom edge of this massive structure is a handlebar with accelerometers in it, and different people can control it. It basically requires 200 people to control this thing, to pump color in some places or not in others, and basically they can take this structure wherever they want around the public space. So they've kind of, to a certain extent, designed the form. They have built it. They're now kind of controlling it and manipulating it within the space. They're also holding on to it. So this is a massive structure full of helium balloons with about 200 people holding on to it. If they all decided to let go, the entire thing would of course float away. I mean, there were some safeties in there, but they were never tested. But the point is that it relied on people trusting their neighbors not to let go, and it became this kind of self-sustaining thing. Just a few more photos, which might be a little bit more clear, just so you can kind of see the scale of this thing. It was in London a few years later, no, maybe a couple of years later, and so this was down in Holland Park. Now, what was kind of interesting to me was that, just going through a few more photos here, is that out of this, the sense of participation that some of the people had kind of took me by surprise. So this was a blog post that came out soon afterwards, like the next week, where the person talked about it being, hey, that's my baby up there. No mention of this being an artwork or some kind of, dumb participatory project. It was like, that was something I did. That was actually mine. And a year ago, somebody came to me after I gave a talk about this and showed this scrapbook that she'd put together about her experiencing being part of that whole process. And that was really interesting to me because, in a sense, I'd kind of done this as a bit of sort of mass participation spectacle, but I hadn't actually planned on this kind of idea of people owning, in a sense, in a very positive sense, the thing that they'd created. So then, whoops, I think I have to go through that again. So, the limitations or the failures here, the criticisms, if you like. So this was, at the end of the day, this was largely about pattern making. The people that were actually erecting this thing were basically just configuring shapes on the floor, and they're making pretty pictures in the air, and there was not necessarily a connection between what they were doing and how they then understood the light patterns would be generated in space. There was another fundamental flaw here that I'd totally not even thought of, which is that everyone on the handlebar actually, kind of pumping color in and kind of creating these patterns by waving it around, they were the ones who couldn't actually see what they were doing there. The people with the best view was basically the people who had opted out of participating in it because they were sort of, several hundred meters back. The second limitation was that, for all the kind of involvement that people had, it was very much a temporary thing. People came together, did something fun, and had no kind of persistence after that. I mean, I don't know that anyone kind of kept in touch unless somebody hooked up around it. I don't know. But, it was temporary. I've kind of had this question about whether that is a problem, is that a bug or a feature of participatory projects, the fact that they're temporary. And I kind of, I fall back and forth on that at different times. Moving on to Patch Bay. So Patch Bay was basically, the first prototype for this was in 2005, but it kind of went public or was open to the public in 2008. It was basically a kind of a generalized data infrastructure for the Internet of Things. And although I'd kind of originally launched it basically as a kind of a way to connect up buildings that could talk, in the end, Patch Bay was used by, actually we had a developer community in 2011 of 50,000 people, and it was generating 100 million data points per day from radiation devices, from air quality monitors, from energy monitors, from seismographs, from all sorts of things, Arduinos, of course, building management systems, home automation systems, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It was basically kind of a generalized message broker for connected objects and connected environments that was relatively easy for people to start using. In other words, rather than being a kind of a Cisco or IBM product that you had to use, you could just use this thing with basic web technologies. Now, I want to just focus on one aspect of this, which is what happened in Japan following the radiation crisis in 2011, which is that we suddenly discovered that there was a lot of activity in our Japanese community following the disaster at the Fukushima nuclear power plant. And within a couple of weeks, there were almost 2,000 feeds from across the country of people getting data and pushing it to Patch Bay in order to share it. Where the local governments had been able to get data out only sometimes once per week in PDF format and measured 100 meters off the ground. Here, people were plugging in their radiation devices and sharing that data in real time, sometimes in once per second. And so this became a bit of an exercise of people just wanting to share and express themselves through data. of course, there was a massive criticism at the time about, oh, it's dirty data. Everyone's using data in a different way. They're using different models. They're using different units to describe their radiation. I mean, they're amateurs. They don't even know how to point a radiation sensor in the right direction, et cetera, et cetera. But I think what those kind of criticisms missed was that this was an effort by people in time of crisis to just do something and make sense of what was going on around them. And most importantly, I think, to actually share that experience with each other, to kind of feel, especially in the context of Japan, where prior to the disaster, of course, the faith in government was almost total. And suddenly people realized that they had to work together to deal with this. But what came after that was actually even more interesting for me, because this wasn't about the data. This was about what people started to do with all of that data. This was something called Japan Geiger Maps, created by Haiyan Zhang, where she took all that data, and nobody else had done this before. None of the government officials, none of the web interfaces on CNN or anything had done this before. She looked at pre and post disaster radiation levels, and she compared the exposure time to the health effects. Because, of course, the thing about radiation is it doesn't matter how high the radiation is. What matters is how long you've been exposed to it for, which was absolutely crucial to making sense of what was going on. So you could be exposed to a low level, but for a long duration, and it would still be dangerous. And so this became a kind of a central board where loads of people discussed all these issues around radiation. There were kind of visualizations. This was a heat map that showed where the radiation is currently peaking. This is all built by the community, I should say. This was a kind of a 3D fly-through, so that you could actually see the different hotspots around the country as trends over time. The Winds of Fukushima Android app it took wind sensor data and the radiation data to predict where the radiation might peak next, and so on and so forth. People just kept on kind of building these different tools to make sense of the data and to share that experience. So, for example, if you didn't have a connected radiation monitor, if you just had a normal kind of Geiger counter, somebody created this form where you could just upload the data manually. Somebody else built an SMS alert app where if you didn't have a radiation sensor at all, you could just put an SMS alert on your neighbors and you would get an alert when there was something significant happen. So this was a sort of an exercise of people just coming together to respond through data about something that was actually vitally important to them that just wasn't being served anywhere else. Now, in terms of the limitations or the kind of problems with this, one was that Patch Bay never really became something for non-experts. As much as we tried to make it as simple as possible, and it even got integrated into the Arduino interface, and you could sort of just add the Patch Bay library and do stuff. We never really managed to crack how to involve people who didn't actually want to do all the sort of fundamental building block building. The second thing is we never cracked the financial model. It was costing, I don't know, something like probably £25,000 per month to maintain stuff, and there was just no way, the servers, the salaries, and everything like that. We never cracked the financial model, and in the end, it was acquired by a US software company in 2011, as you mentioned in the introduction. So this was something that I really took away, and I've continued to think about. First of all, when you're deploying something like this, some kind of infrastructure for participation, how can you make sure that actually there are many entry points into this? In a sense, the entry points for, let's say, non-experts became through the application level, and so the community kind of took care of that. But in the future, I wanted to be thinking more about this quite explicitly. And again, the financial model. How do you actually make this stuff kind of exist and persist in the kind of practicalities of the world? 2012, I did this project called Linguini, Another Life, up in Bradford, which was basically an operating system for the public space. I was originally commissioned to come as a lighting designer to sort of do nice little pretty patterns with colored lights. And what I discovered was there was this kind of plan to deploy all of this technology into the city center, fountains, lasers, lights, weather stations, cameras, all this kind of connected furniture. And there was no plan for what would happen to any of these things. They'd basically just be switched on. And the reason that you see architectural lighting and bridge lighting, just basically going cyan, magenta, yellow, cyan, magenta, yellow, red, green, blue, cyan, magenta. Yeah, that's because nobody really has a plan, and that is what the default setting is for that kind of stuff. And so what we ended up doing was basically saying, let's build an operating system that enables you to rapidly reconfigure the way all of this stuff is connected. So if you want to, in the first stage, if the council wants to make the fountains kind of respond as people walk past, then they can just very easily connect. I'm going to run that video again. They can very easily connect the fountains, the cameras to the fountains. If you want the lights to follow you or to run away or to respond to the weather, or if you want the mirror pool to fill up and then it kind of erupt in an explosion when the local team makes a goal or something like that, the local football team, all of that is possible. Now, what we're trying to do this year, just trying to raise the budget for it, is to open that operating system up further so that members of the public can actually use the same kind of system, so that they can reprogram that public space on the fly, so that they can design kind of mini applications for connecting up all these different things. So that's in Bradford. It is a permanent. It's a permanent thing there. It wasn't just a sort of temporary thing. But its limitations were maintenance and ownership. So this was a commission by the council. It was kind of delivered to them. But what we've found is that, because my God, we write these operational manuals that are massive. We go into all of the details so that everyone that we work with can just effectively troubleshoot and deal with anything that comes up and really kind of own it themselves. We never do kind of closed source things where we are kind of contractually going to come and repair it at a high fee every time. But in this case, even though we made a very simple system, it was basically built on PHP, which is like a clunky legacy language, just to be as simple as possible, clear text programming and this massive operational manual. We still get kind of called in. It's nice to be called in, but we still get called in for maintenance and to make repairs and to kind of do things like deal with the fact that somebody plugged in a USB thing with a virus on it and what have you. So that notion that they would really take ownership of it has not fully materialized just yet. I hope in this next iteration, where we're going to be trying to work with local students and especially the Media Museum, that they'll kind of take it on. The second is that, frankly, the engagement is a little bit clunky, right? It's sort of responding to movement, lights, fountains, weather stations, these kinds of things. And I think that what I would have liked to have done would have been to have a totally open interface where you can actually decide not just how does an input map onto an output, but what are the inputs that we're going to bring into this system? How can we kind of plug in more stuff, or indeed outputs? Moving along, Flight Path Toronto. This was a project with Natalie Jeremijenko about 5 years ago in Toronto. And this started with, basically I was invited to do a kind of a spectacle in the city center that would cater to potentially 100,000 people in one night. And as we started talking about it and looking at the city center, which was kind of filled with birds, we talked a lot about transportation and the way that birds get around the city, and the way that actually the kind of wonder of transportation has been erased, because actually getting to work is such a horribly frustrating activity filled with congestion and air quality problems and what have you. And we started looking at alternative transportation systems, and looking more specifically at the zip line, which is an ancient technology, basically just uses gravity, but it's fast, it's fun, it's emissionless, and the most interesting thing for me is that it's very rapid to deploy, and if you make a mistake, you can redeploy it somewhere else. very often with our transportation systems, we have to make a decision that then takes 10 years to implement, and then if you make a mistake, it's kind of there for another 20 years, and it makes everyone very reluctant to experiment with transportation in the city. But the idea of actually using zip lines around the city as an agile, very kind of rapid prototyping way of experimenting with transportation and lines of desire and everything within the city seemed like a kind of fruitful way to do it. So what we ended up doing was basically creating these lines around Nathan Phillips Square, which was the place I showed you a photo of earlier. And then we created a flight school where people could come and they could train and they could learn how to fly the zip line as a bird. Here's some video from people kind of going across and kind of experiencing what it'd be like to kind of zip line to work as a bird. We had this kind of control tower in the middle that was kind of directing the different flyers and times to move, and that control tower was controlled by the crowd. So rather than there being a kind of a single central authority, it was about the crowd controlling the passengers. And we had all sorts of people going through, young and old, and there was sort of even a grandmother who kind of enjoyed that. So flight paths limitations or my kind of critiques of it. First of all, there was team and technical failure. This was a sort of a transatlantic collaboration. A lot of the things didn't actually work that needed to. The zip line is meant to be such a simple technology. It's like a cable and some wheels. But in terms of actually doing something with 100,000 people, the safety infrastructure, simply because it was the first time it was ever done, on top of the basic zip line, was probably 10 times as much kind of physical stuff. So we had a lot of problems there. Secondly, the interesting thing to me was this idea of rapid deployment and decision-making by members of the public, that they could actually get involved in deciding what are the appropriate lines of transportation. They weren't in the end, because of the technical failures and the fact that we only had, I think we had 6 rather than 11 lines open, and it was raining and all these kinds of things. Actually, that decision-making never got fully tested or evaluated, which was which I think would have been crucial. Voiceover. So this was a project actually from earlier this year. I'm just going to pause it for a second. We were invited up into Hordern in the northeast of England. It's just it's in East Durham, just south of Newcastle, where we were basically commissioned to deal with or to kind of like discuss and kind of bring out more kind of conversation around issues to do with community cohesion, issues to do with the fact that Hordern had kind of dropped off the technological map when you look at the kind of council funding priorities. There used to be a great transportation line going through this, but it was the train line was removed a couple of decades ago. This is former mining territory. And what we discovered when we were there was that the thing that people kept on talking about was not having a voice. Not having a voice, but also the idea that if you were, oh my gosh, I'm totally blanking on the name. Yeah, if you were in Peterlee, which is the village next to Hordern, 2 kilometers away, it would be very odd if you married somebody in Hordern. That would be a traitor. Somebody actually mentioned the fact that one of his friends became known as the fellow who married someone from Peterlee for the rest of his life. So this kind of sense of identity had kind of crystallized in a way that meant that people talked even less. And so over the course of this project, which is basically 2 years, we started looking at using voice to kind of bring people together. And just to describe it as I kind of run this project, what we ended up doing, and this was really after probably 15 or 20 prototypes of testing kind of our presumptions and building stuff on site and seeing what people wanted and how they wanted to use it. Whoops, I'm not going to get to the limitation just yet. What eventually emerged was basically this kind of interactive chain of light and sound that weaved its way through the public streets of Horden. Going to go back to the map over here. Where there were these kinds of booths placed in public space around the area where people could go and speak, or they could perform, or they could tell jokes, or they could do whatever. And that sound, that kind of communication would turn into this kind of bouncing light that would bounce down the streets, and you could see where that sound would go. So it was like an infrastructure made physically visible, a radically public communication infrastructure. The sound actually would go into people's living rooms. They had a little radio box where they could tune in and they could listen and they could kind of be part of this conversation. And one which was explicitly about people kind of sharing and making very kind of visceral the lines of communication. The other thing was that this was built, I mean, if I can get a little bit technical for a second, this was built as an ad hoc mesh network, basically. There was no centralizing server. Every one of the nodes connecting up this chain was hosted by somebody who said, I want to be a link in the chain. So we actually had no idea where this kind of infrastructure would percolate, because somebody would say, yeah, I want one on my street. But if you have one on your street, you've got to get 10 other people between you and the next node. So you use this kind of technological apparatus almost as an excuse to go and have a conversation with the neighbor that you've actually never spoken to across the road. So in a sense, this became less of a kind of an infrastructure solution and more a reason to have conversations. And it had another layer on top, which of course is that the content of this network gets managed by the residents themselves. They had to decide, how do we deal with censorship? How do we deal with topics? Some people said, we don't want to have any political discussion here. Others said, we don't want to have any religious discussion here. And others said, and so really what this project did was kind of bring out a series of governance tools, if you like, that were determined by the people actually taking over this kind of infrastructure. So if I just kind of show a bit of video now, it'll make a bit more sense perhaps.
Piece of land down Horden Way, where miners used to work both night and day.
So people used it for poetry, they had conversations, kids used it to tell jokes.
They're going to be singing It's a Hard Knock Life of Annie.
Wow! Oh, I'm not used to
It's very difficult to capture this in video, I'm afraid, because it was, it just looks like kind of flashing lights, but it really was about that kind of experience of conversation. One of the interesting things that came out was that 3 cousins who had no idea they were living next to each other were all within a couple of kilometers of each other.
Chicken. Chicken pop.
The problems with voiceover first was disengagement. Actually, we went into this thinking, oh, everyone's going to be really enthusiastic about this sort of, this project. We hadn't even got to the technology or anything yet, but we just thought, okay, this was an area that's basically been excluded from any kind of, spectacular artwork or any kind of, fun kind of urban project. But actually, the friction to get people even remotely interested was way beyond what we'd expected. And our local partner, the one who was there to basically make our lives easier, basically said, this is too difficult, and they quit. They quit the project. So what we did was we went and we actually moved some of the team up into Horden and actually stayed there and did all the knocking on doors ourselves as complete strangers, as Londoners, as people like me with a funny accent, And so it was really, really difficult. And because of the kind of length of time that it ended up taking, we got people interested and intrigued and involved, but it took us another 10 weeks to get somewhere else. And by that point, they'd kind of forgotten about it or decided not to be part of it. So all of that was really difficult. This really took home for me that actually having that local partner, they've really got to be bought into the long-term vision of this kind of project. We'd kind of all largely agreed at the beginning that we didn't know how it was going to turn out. and that this was a trust exercise. We need better ways to kind of get people to actually sign up to that in theory. The second was that we just had this massive weather and equipment failure. And this was down to us not being able to test. It is really difficult to test an ad hoc mesh network in urban space without actually deploying the entire thing. And I have no idea how we're going to get around this if we ever do this kind of thing again, because you can't test it without doing the full thing. And once you spot a problem, you've got to kind of take it all down and discover that actually, yes, rain does affect that kind of antenna and mean that these things can no longer communicate. I've just got a couple more things. I was going to talk about Thinkful, but I don't know whether I will. Thinkful is basically just a search engine for the Internet of Things. So where Patchbay was a platform for data, there's now thousands of these platforms. And so Thinkful is something we launched about 3 years ago to search all of the different platforms around the world, whatever the kind of data there is. And not to aggregate and centralize that data, but just to make it possible for you to find it. So you might say something like, what's the air quality in New York? And you'll see that there are sort of half a dozen different kinds of networks of air quality. You don't just have to go to New York City's air quality. You can go to the Air Quality Egg, which is a citizen-contributed air quality initiative. You can go to AQICN, is probably somewhere here, et cetera, et cetera. That's a longer story. We'll leave that one for now. Thinkful's limitations, it's esoteric. I mean, it's, who cares about data, finding data, one of the fundamental things about Thinkful is that, we're really concerned about data owners having control over their data. I'm really beginning to wonder whether people really care about that. And anyway, Google's going to do it, so. Cinder. So I was just going to talk about these last two projects quite quickly. So Cinder, I'm showing you the final bit right now. It's basically an augmented reality cat that lives in a school in Cambridge. And this cat is responding to the building management system, to the data of the energy usage, of the solar generation on the roof, and to the weather data around and usage and students. And basically this cat, I was very much inspired in this project. I should actually say this because this was from RCA, by a project, I think it was in 98 or 99. I'm sure some people here will remember Flirt by Fiona Raby, Shona Kitchen, Ben Hooker, and probably others. Do people know what I'm talking about? Yeah, Ramya remembers this well. So that was a project where there was a cat that disappeared on the mobile network, and I think it was on Nokia phones or something like that. And you'd be able to sort of find the cat around. Also inspired by Denno Coil, this, if you're familiar with this Japanese anime, and The Matrix, where the cat is the glitch in the network. And so what we have here is basically this cat that's responding to the data of the building. It becomes an avatar for the building, for the students to understand the state of this building. So this cat changes, it's going to change over the next few years. Its size, its color, its behavior, the accessories it wears, and every now and then, when you've interacted with it too much in this central space, it disappears into the network and appears on one student's laptop. Everyone's got these kind of these sort of school apps. And at that moment, as you might have seen, so here it's got really big because people a lot of people have been interacting with it. But when the energy usage of the building goes up too high, and when its activity has been, when the energy use has gone too high and the solar generation has gone down too low, it gets hungry and it goes out on the network and looks for food. And this is the point at which, if the student actually has this kind of notification that the cat is in their laptop right now, they have to make a decision about whether to feed the cat based on how much solar energy has been generated by the building that day. So it's this kind of moment where they kind of make an assessment of the weather and the expected solar generation coming over the rest of the day and how much the cat has already been fed. It's that moment of decision where they can kind of like really think about their usage of the building and the cat's ability to kind of live, et cetera, et cetera. And so this actually came about. I'm not going to show the whole video here, but
They have come up with this one.
it was basically done in cooperation with the students over a period of a couple of years. Because this was a new school. These students were coming into this school from another school. And it was basically with them that we worked out the idea of the cat and its accessories and what it would respond to. And this guy was a great salesman. He was absolutely fantastic. We had endless these kind of exercises where they would talk about what it would look like, what it would imply, how they would actually kind of own this cat, how they would actually make it theirs, how it would change over time. So every now and then it'll wear these weird accessories that they chose. For example, on May the 4th, Star Wars Day, it sort of appears with a lightsaber. On certain days it'll wear a sort of sombrero to kind of celebrate. And yeah, so that is that. So, limitations. The problem that I had here, although I'm really happy with this project, but ultimately the students' decisions didn't actually change anything. They made a decision about the cat, but I really would have loved if their decision making had been able to affect the building itself somehow, to actually go back and materially affect the building. I hold out hope that a future iteration of this kind of project would be able to do that, now that we've kind of effectively de-risked everything else, but it just didn't achieve that. Second was that it was kind of too cute, and I think there's a bit of a distraction about the kind of, the importance of all the complexity of this cat, because it responds to so many different things in so many different ways. We basically worked with one of the animators from the Harry Potter movies to kind of create this cat in all its sort of many different iterations. Finally, I'm going to just finish on natural fuse, because for me, this project, although it's from 2009, comes closest to the kind of decision-making framework that I think I'm particularly interested in.
Power available to the socket is limited
so
by the capacity of the...
There is a plant with a power socket on it, and the amount of power that is available to that power socket is limited by the capacity of the plant to offset its carbon footprint. The idea is to kind of use this kind of unit to remain carbon neutral. Now the problem is that even a low wattage lamp needs 6 plants to offset its power, its carbon footprint. And so what we do is all of these devices are actually networked using the internet. So when you switch on your device and you try and get power, it checks out on the network to see if there are 5 other units that are not being used. And if they are, then you can get as much energy as you need to, and the community as a whole retains a neutral carbon footprint. But what we actually have is that on the device is a switch which is either selfless or selfish. So let's say there's not enough units out there. Let's say there's only 3 or 4. If you choose selfless and you start to go into the red of the carbon footprint of the community, then it will switch off your energy before you harm the carbon footprint of the community. That's why it's a natural fuse. However, you can also choose to be selfish, and I think it's absolutely vital in participatory systems to kind of embrace the fact that people need in many situations to act selfishly. You might have heard an intruder in your flat and you absolutely need to get the light on. So you can choose selfish and you'll get as much energy as you want. But if you harm the footprint of the community, then what it does is it sends a kill signal out into somebody else's plant, and it gives it a vinegar injection, which effectively removes a resource from this kind of communalized carbon sink. Now, in practice, what we do is we actually give every plant 3 lives, a little bit like a video game, and you get an email at the time of that kind of activity, where the one who's kind of lost a life can say, hey, why did you act selfishly? And the person who acted selfishly can say, well, listen, there was somebody in my flat and I needed to have the light on and what have you. The point is to kind of use this kind of system to encourage and enable cooperative behavior, but not absolutely require it. And secondly, when selfish behavior is required, to provide this kind of chain of accountability so that people can actually explain and hopefully build up this kind of sense of empathy and understanding about the complexity of selfish versus selfless behavior. So just to finish off with its kind of limitations, First of all, so we did this in about 6 or 7 different cities around the world, where we kind of set up a shop and people would take these units for about 3 to 6 months. There were about 30 units, and they paid for it by bringing their own plants to act as carbon sink to kind of contribute to the exercise. By the way, everything in the entire project was carbon offset. So it was an entire carbon economy where the production of the units, the maintenance of them, even the travel, all featured in the calculus about the carbon footprint of the community. But ultimately, the people who took these devices tended to be the ones who cared about carbon footprints and whatnot. And I would have loved to figure out a way to involve those who did not care about it. And secondly, try as we might, we've never figured out how to make this scale. People have often said, oh, you could do this with trees and forests or something like that. But what really makes this important is the fact that you have a plant in your home that you own and you take responsibility for. And that doesn't quite happen when you got trees and forests outside. In fact, one of the things we noticed, at first we used to have a demo unit set up in the shop, and it was always put onto selfish mode because nobody kind of owned it. And so anyone felt kind of comfortable putting it into that mode and just seeing what havoc it could wreak on the network. So we never figured out how to scale this model, and maybe it doesn't actually need to. So with all of that, I just want to wrap up and say, ultimately what I'm trying to do here is just probe all of the ways that I as a designer can continually kind of step out at least some part of the process. I mean, you're always grappling with this issue that as the designer of a system, you are always imposing certain constraints on it, and the act of design to a certain extent is simply about putting constraints there. But the question really is how can you constantly kind of dodge those constraints and enable them to keep being flexible? And secondly, just that idea of, again, coming back to the idea of building a shared memory of a possible future. I mean, I think that is absolutely vital right now. Our concept of the future is really under attack at the moment. In that sense, it's bleak times, and it's so important for us to actually construct a future and to figure out how we're going to construct that future. And so, thank you very much.